Conference Board of Canada also does a comprehensive environmental performance ranking of large, wealthy, industrialized countries. And again, the countries that come out well in this have environmental provisions in their constitutions. The countries at the bottom, Canada, the US, Australia, Japan, do not. So there's a clear correlation between environmental performance and constitutional provision. Most first statistical analyses that I did were snapshots of environmental performance at a point in time. I also wanted to see what happened over, or as the years went by, whether we could distinguish countries with environmental provisions from their counterparts. So the countries at the top of this slide are countries that do have environmental provisions in their constitution. Countries at the bottom do not. And I looked at trends related to air pollution and climate change. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In terms of nitrogen oxide emissions, which contribute to smog and contribute to acid rain, the countries with constitutional environmental provisions between 1980 and 2010 reduced nitrogen oxide emissions 10 times faster than the countries at the bottom. In terms of sulfur dioxide emissions, the countries on the top reduced emissions over that 30-year period by 88% on average. The countries on the bottom reduced sulfur dioxide emissions by about 50% on average. And in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions that cause climate change, the countries with constitutional environmental provisions on average reduced their emissions between 1990 and 2010 by 7.8%, where emissions rose by an average of 3% in the countries. So basically the summary of that is that these provisions are clearly and closely correlated with superior environmental performance. And this last map is just a map that shows not only countries whose constitutions recognize the right to a healthy environment, but also those countries that have signed international treaties, that have changed their laws to environmental laws to recognize the right. And when you add up all of those different categories, you get 177 out of the 193 UN nations that at this point in history recognize the human right to a healthy environment. An extraordinary development over the course of 4 decades, leaving only 16 countries in the world that do not recognize the human right to live in a healthy environment. Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, Lebanon, Kuwait, Oman, Brunei, Darussalam, Laos, North Korea, and Cambodia. I ask you, which group of countries should Canada belong to? And so that's what I want to turn to next. So there has been a tremendous spread of this right around the world. To me, that's a good reason for Canada changing our constitution to recognize the right to a healthy environment. It has a clear impact on environmental laws, on court decisions, and on environmental performance. That's another good reason. And as I alluded to earlier, when you look at Canada's environmental ranking, we really are at the bottom of the pack amongst industrialized nations. And really, you don't have to take my word for it. You can take it from our word for it. This is our wildlife loving Prime Minister, and 4.5 years ago, in a year-end interview with CTV, Stephen Harper said, and this is a direct quote, "By most any measure, Canada's environmental record is among the worst in the industrialized world." Well, we can talk about what you should do about that later, but certainly rolling back environmental laws and policies is not the answer. So Canada's weak environmental performance is actually, it's embarrassing. We can kind of joke about it, but it has life and death consequences. The World Health Organization estimates that approximately 30,000 deaths in Canada each year are attributable in whole or in part to environmental causation. And that's a shocking number, 30,000 premature deaths. It's consistent, though, with studies that have been done by the Canadian Medical Association, which estimates that in the neighborhood of 20,000 premature deaths are attributable to air pollution alone. And we also have a profoundly disturbing situation in Canada where we have thousands of people living on reserves in Aboriginal communities who don't only lack access to safe drinking water, they literally don't have running water in their homes. They have to take buckets down to lakes and carry water back to their homes. They have to use outhouses in the winter in Manitoba in 40-below weather. I mean, these are just conditions that cannot be tolerated in a country like Canada. And this problem we have with Canada's constitution is not something that's just recently flared up. This is a picture of Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier back who in 1910 appointed a commission on conservation. And one of the commission's first reports was on this new problem of water pollution. And the Commission on Conservation, in their report, said that one of the problems that was impeding Canada's ability to deal with water pollution was uncertainty about which level of government was responsible for protecting the environment. And that's a problem that has persisted right through to this day. In fact, there was a court decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in the late 1990s in a prosecution of Hydro-Quebec for dumping PCBs into a Quebec river, in which we came within a hair's breadth of losing the core of Canada's most important environmental law because of this problem of constitutional uncertainty. It was a 5-4 Supreme Court of Canada decision in favor of upholding the law. If one more judge had gone the other way, we would have lost the heart of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And as I mentioned earlier, environmental rights and responsibilities are a fundamental cornerstone of Indigenous legal systems. This is a book by Professor John Borrows, one of the most brilliant legal scholars in Canada, and he talks clearly about how this is a part of Indigenous constitutional law. And in Canada we have three basic sources of law. We have the English common law, the French civil law, and then we have Indigenous law. And we've done a very good job of integrating common law and civil law into our contemporary legal system. And we've done a very poor job of integrating Indigenous law. So putting environmental rights and responsibilities into our Constitution today would be a means of bringing Indigenous law back into our legal system. And the last reason why Canada should amend its Constitution to recognize the right to a healthy environment is that opinion polls show that 90% of Canadians support recognition of the right to a healthy environment. And in fact, and this is kind of disturbing, over half of Canadians believe that the right to a healthy environment is already in the Charter of Rights, which is certainly not the case. Now I have to make a brief foray into history here. This is a picture of Prime Minister Trudeau doing yoga on the banks of the Nahanni River. Pierre Trudeau, when he was a law professor at the University of Montreal before entering politics, was bullish on including a wide array of human rights in constitutions. Not just the civil and political rights that we have in the Charter, but economic and social rights as well. Of course, when he became Prime Minister, his views became more conservative in terms of recognizing human rights. But he does deserve a lot of credit for bringing Canada into the 20th century in terms of the protection of human rights. And he appointed in the early 1970s a special committee of the House of Commons and the Senate, which traveled across Canada from coast to coast, soliciting the opinions of Canadians on what a new Canadian Constitution should contain. And there was a tremendous outpouring of interest in those hearings. In Vancouver, in 1971, they had to turn hundreds of people away because they simply didn't have the capacity to hear from them. And so this was another of my forays into the basement of the UBC Law Library, to read the transcripts of those hearings which took place between 1970 and 72. And I can tell you it was full of moments of inspiration, because there were ordinary Canadians who spoke to this joint Senate House of Commons committee, arguing that the right to a healthy environment was one of the most important things that the government could consider putting into Canada's Constitution. Incredibly poetic and lyrical submissions were made to that committee. At the end of the day, however, those submissions were ignored, and as you know, by the time 1981 rolled around, we had a draft Constitution with no mention of the environment in it. This is Sven Robinson, some of you may recall, Canada's first openly gay member of Parliament. At the 11th hour, Sven Robinson, who was a member of the committee doing the clause-by-clause review of the draft Constitution, a committee called the Hayes Royale Committee, he proposed an amendment that would have recognized the right to live in a healthy environment. And unfortunately, the Minister of Justice of Canada at the time was this gentleman, Jean Chrétien. And Jean Chrétien's response, which I'll paraphrase because he made his response in French, but it was translated into English. He said, "Oh, come on, Sven. The next thing you know, you will want to put the apple pie and the recipe of my Aunt Bertha into the Constitution." That was the Minister of Justice's response to a proposal to put the right to a healthy environment into Canada's Constitution in 1981. I couldn't believe it when I read that in the transcripts. But anyways, they voted, and the 22 progressive conservatives and liberals on that committee voted against the amendment. The 2 NDPs voted in favor of it, and the result was a Charter of Rights and Freedoms with no mention whatsoever of the environment. So of course, after the Constitution was repatriated in 1982, the government changed. We had Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, we had the Meese Lake Accord, the Charlottetown Lake Accord, and despite the efforts of environmental activists across the country, despite the endorsement of the Canadian Bar Association, those accords did not include the right to a healthy environment. And that may have been one of the contributing factors to their widespread unpopularity. And so since that time, there's been ongoing discussion of adding the right to a healthy environment to the Constitution, but no progress has been made. Just to pause and say, we don't have the right to a healthy environment in our Constitution, but there are actually 5 provinces and territories that have legislation recognizing the right to live in a healthy environment. The first was Quebec in 1978 in its Environmental Quality Act. The second was Ontario in 1993 with its Environmental Bill of Rights. The 3 Northern Territories as well. And then in a very interesting development in 2006, when Thomas Mulcair was the Minister of Environment in Quebec, he oversaw the addition of the right to a healthy environment to Quebec's Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which brings Quebec in alignment with much of the rest of the civilized world. So that's where we stand today. There was an effort made to enact the Canadian Environmental Bill of Rights. A bill was introduced by NDP MP Linda Duncan. It actually got the support of all of the opposition parties in the previous Parliament, went through first reading, went through second reading, and was scheduled for third reading when the Conservatives dropped their red last year for the election. So that's now gone onto the back burner for the time being. So how do we, as a Canadian society that values environmental protection, how do we actually get the right to a healthy environment recognized as a constitutional right in this country? Well, there are 3 ways, actually. The first is the most clear and direct route, and that's amending the Constitution directly. That's a very difficult thing to do, as many of you will know. It requires the approval of Parliament and 7 of the 10 provinces, all of which have to be obtained in a 3-year period. Politically very challenging, but not impossible. The Constitution has been amended 11 times since 1982, including 2 modest changes to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so it's possible, but it's the kind of thing that will probably need a narrow and focused effort on an issue that enjoys a huge level of national support, which sounds to me exactly like the right to a healthy environment. So Eco-Justice and the David Suzuki Foundation are in the very early days of beginning to work towards this long-term goal of amending the Canadian Constitution. The second route to recognition of the constitutional right to a healthy environment is through litigation. And in fact, the case that's been brought by Ron Plain and Ada Lockridge of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation is making the argument that the right to live in a healthy environment is actually implicit in the right to life, liberty, and security of the person that already exists in Section 7 of the Charter. And in the course of my research, I actually came across 20 countries where the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court had found exactly that, had agreed with lawyers that the right to life must include the right to a healthy environment. So there's many precedents out there. The Supreme Court of Canada has a very strong track record in environmental cases, and so there's reason for hope in that sense. And in fact, there's been 3 environmental cases in the last 15 years where the Supreme Court of Canada has referred with approval to the concept of a right to a healthy environment. So it may be that one day a case like that of Ada Lockridge and Ron Plain reaches our highest court, and we get a court decision that brings us more in line with countries around the world. And then the third and final way that we can achieve constitutional recognition of the right to a healthy environment in Canada is slightly more obscure. There's a process in Canada that is available to the federal, provincial, and territorial governments called a judicial reference. And this is a process by which governments can ask the courts for their opinion on a hypothetical legal question of great importance. So theoretically, a government could ask the court to answer the question, does Section 7 of the Charter, the right to life, include an implicit right to a healthy environment? And the advantage of doing it through a judicial reference is you don't have all the factual problems that face you in a highly contested lawsuit like the Sarn Chemical Valley litigation. There's been over 100 judicial references over the course of Canadian history dealing with issues ranging from who owns offshore natural resources, is it the federal government, the British government, is it legal for Quebec to secede from the rest of Canada? And more recently, questions were posed to the Supreme Court of Canada about same-sex marriage. Probably the most famous judicial reference in Canadian history, though, was the Persons case of the 1920s, where Nellie McClung and her colleagues mounted an incredible campaign, actually. They secured the signatures of hundreds of thousands of Canadians in the 1920s in their efforts to have the government recognize that women should be considered persons under Section 24 of the British North America Act, and thereby be eligible to be appointed to the Canadian Senate. And so Nellie McClung and her colleagues worked this campaign for a decade in the 1920s and finally convinced the federal government to use this judicial reference tool. So the federal government in 1929 asked the Supreme Court of Canada, are women persons for purposes of being appointed to the Senate? And you know what the Supreme Court of Canada said? They said no. But at the time, you could appeal Supreme Court of Canada decisions to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the UK, and their common sense prevailed. And the Judicial Committee said, oh, for God's sake, of course women are persons. And that was a real turning point for the women's rights movement in Canada. And so I think there's an opportunity to use that same kind of a process to try and advance the right to a healthy environment here in the 21st century. That's pretty much what I wanted to say to you this evening. I'll just close by asking, the fundamental question I'm on day 2 of a cross-country book tour. The question I get asked is, would it really make a difference for Canadians? And I think the question, if you ask that question of the people of Sydney, Nova Scotia, who've lived with the devastating health and environmental consequences of the tar sands for decades without any proper remediation, cleanup, or restoration, the answer would surely have to be yes. If you ask the people who live in Chemical Valley near Sarnia, Ontario, the answer would clearly have to be yes. If you ask Aboriginal people living on reserves without running water, the answer would surely have to be yes. If you ask families whose children suffer from asthma because of pollution in the air, the answer would have to be yes. If you ask endangered species pushed to the brink of extinction by reckless human activity, surely the answer would have to be yes. And so I think that if you care about our health, our children's health, our planet's health, and the health of future generations, the right to a healthy environment, gaining constitutional recognition in Canada, has the potential to make us a cleaner, greener, healthier, wealthier, and in the long run, happier nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We've got some time for questions too. So.
Yeah, I'd love to answer questions, and I always forget to do it. I'd be remiss if I didn't say there are copies of the book